Oh shoot, let me.
Welcome to this episode of Canna Plus, a podcast produced by the Cannabis Law Society at St. Louis University School of Law, where we have conversations with interesting people about the past, present, and future of cannabis in America. I'm August President of the Cannabis Law Society, and today I'm so excited to be joined by Joe Plenzler. Joe, how's it going? Good.
Going great. Yeah, thanks for inviting me on your show.
No problem. Joe is a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he's an expert on the state of play regarding cannabis policy and how it affects veterans. A little bit of background: Joe served as both an infantry officer and a public affairs officer in the Marine Corps. He worked for General Mattis during the invasion of Iraq. He was a military spokesperson for the coordinated relief efforts after the 2004 tsunami that hit Indonesia. He worked as a spokesperson, press secretary, and in other roles for multiple commandants of the Marine Corps. And since retiring from an illustrious military career, Joe has served as the director of media relations for the American Legion. And today he's active in the nonprofit space. He's an adjunct professor. He consults with leaders about organizational change and communication, and he writes interesting articles.
Thanks.
But above all, he's a mountaineer. He's an advocate for veterans, particularly on healthcare issues. And I'm so enthused that you're with us today. So before we go kind of boldly into the fray and discuss current issues about policy and veterans, I just want to understand where you're coming from in relation to cannabis. Basically, what was your perception of the plant growing up? I think that,
Yeah,
cannabis is kind of a taboo subject in America for a lot of different reasons. And kind of what was the narrative that you and your family heard and your community heard about cannabis when you were growing up?
yeah. No, I grew up in a very devout Catholic family. Went to grade school with Notre Dame nuns that are, it was like a parochial school, Catholic high school. And so the narrative we always, heard growing up during the 80s and 90s, especially during the Reagan administration, was the whole um, just say no to drugs campaign. So I remember seeing the commercials on TV with like your brain on drugs, and then they'd crack an egg in the pan and things like that. So, the scare techniques were well in play. And, and I think for some drugs it's entirely appropriate, but that was kind of my frame growing up. And but I also really enjoy science and value the scientific method. And so when this issue kind of came up in my portfolio of things to advocate for, at first I was kind of skeptical. They're like, hey, we want you to push for research, and I was like, oh, come on, really? But I was open-minded about it. So okay, well, let me dig into the literature and see what we can find. So I talked to a bunch of people, and the more I read, the deeper the rabbit hole went, and the more facts I was able to gather about the potential for cannabinoids for medical use. So, and I think probably one of the most important documents that I came across was the 2017, was it January 2017, that the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine put out a meta-analysis called "The Health Effects of Cannabis and Cannabinoids: The Current State of Evidence and Recommendations in Research." And it's on their website right now. And they said, hey, we've reviewed more than 10,000 studies around the world. As far as our recommendations, we see strong evidence for supporting the notion that it has efficacy in the treatment of chronic pain, the reduction of nausea in chemotherapy patients, and the reduction of spasticity in MS patients. And then, I've seen some of the stuff that the Israelis have done with using CBD to counter childhood epilepsy. So, those things are pretty compelling to me, and that's kind of what really set me down this path.
You mentioned a lot of facts just now. Research it's been done at the clinical level. It's
Yeah,
not just anecdotal. There's so much evidence out there. There's so many hard facts, and it's been that way for hundreds of years. I think you've written before that humans have used cannabis since 6,000 BC. It's
yeah.
part of our DNA, really. And it's interesting that in light of those facts, there was still this heavy propaganda narrative that the U.S.
Mhm,
government put on. I mean, beginning with Harry Anslinger back
mhm.
in the early part of the 20th century. And I'm curious, you as an expert on propaganda and communication, I know you've studied
Yeah.
those areas. Why do you think that the U.S. government campaign was so successful in putting forth this narrative about the dangers, even in light of all those facts that you just mentioned?
Yeah, I think, well, first off, fear campaigns are terribly effective with human beings. The way our minds are hardwired to respond to threats. And so I think, anytime you can trigger somebody's amygdala, you have the opportunity to manipulate their cognitions, right? And that's just a biological fact. And so, I didn't live back then, but from what I've read about the position was, there were a lot of prohibition officers who were, facing the unemployment line with the repeal of the Volstead Act when, alcohol became legal again. So, I think, that reality forced some people to take steps in trying to, criminalize other things so that they would have a continued job and be able to enforce, what substances people can and can't put in their own bodies.
Yeah, and there's such a big stigma still too. So I wonder, kind of, when you started doing your advocacy work over at the American Legion, you started researching these things. Did you face opposition, criticism of people would say, look, we've all heard this narrative, and what are you doing?
Well, I mean, the truth is that they're a very bottom-up organization, right? Very grassroots and driven by the desires of their members. And so the resolution that they produced came out of a post in Ohio, right? And Ohio has always been like number one or number two with the opioid epidemic, right? So one of the veterans who proposed this as a policy position for them realized that there's a nexus between the combat injuries that veterans have faced in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Mostly have been impacted by improvised explosive devices, right? So blast injuries, traumatic brain injury, things like that, post-traumatic stress, and chronic pain, right? So, there's a nexus between chronic pain, overdosing on opioids or being addicted to opioids because VA doctors were prescribing those things like candy, and suicide, right? I mean, there's kind of like this little lethal triangle between the two. And so that's really what this veteran was trying to get after. And God help me, I can't remember his name right now, but I've corresponded with him in the past. But that's how they established an official resolution. So when they matriculated that up through their parliamentary process, I mean, most of the veterans who populate that organization now are Vietnam veterans who were fairly familiar with cannabis from those days. And they were very open-minded, shockingly so, right? This mostly 65 and up cohort of about maybe 1.5 million, 2 million veterans, depending on how they're counting their membership, supported it, right? And it wasn't just that. I mean, we backed it with some quantitative research. So we had the opinion of the nation's largest group of membership group of veterans. And we commissioned a poll, right? So a nationwide poll of veteran households and on the use of medical cannabis, right? And what we found was that we conducted it in October of 2017 and found that 92% of veterans supported medical cannabis research, right? 82% supported medical cannabis as a federally legal treatment option in their home state. So, that was of all veteran households in the United States. And, the systematic random sampling, the margin of error, it was scientifically done. So we thought that was a fairly solid position. And it was even higher with the younger generation of veterans, right? Because they're sick of watching their brothers and sisters who have been impacted by 2 decades of war and struggling with opioid addiction, right? And so if there's a less toxic, less risky way to treat that, I think that we have a responsibility as a society to do the science, right? And really, that's all I've been ever asking for was let's end the hypocrisy on the policy on this issue and just allow scientists to do their work, right? And so that's where we partnered up with Dr. Sue Sisley, who's had the nation's first triple-blind study on the medical efficacy of cannabis for post-traumatic stress. And I actually visited a lab out in Scottsdale, Arizona, with the team, and we got to see her at work. And so, pretty exciting stuff. And really, it's that's the most important thing. It's just kind of like I'm agnostic about the outcome, but if it has the potential to help veterans, then let's do the research and let science speak for itself. Because I can't even tell you how many veterans I've had come to me saying, I was, and the narrative's all the same. It's like I was on basically every drug that killed Anna Nicole Smith, prescribed to me by VA doctors, right? Living like a zombie, And, I tried cannabis for the first time in my life to treat my post-traumatic stress. And for the first time, slept for 6 hours straight at night, right? And just the restorative impact of being able to sleep. And, the narrative continues just like, because I've been able to use medical cannabis in my state, I'm a better human being, right? Because I'm not in pain and I can function better without being, doped up on opioids. So I think we owe it to them to do the science, right?
I think we do it. You've pointed out that it's such an effective treatment, and you mentioned that you've heard a lot of people that can access cannabis in their state, whether it's medical or recreational. I think we're at a point talking about these elections that just happened a couple of days ago. We're recording on November 6th here, and right now, a third of Americans have access to some form of cannabis, which is great. But I think that there are maybe still some barriers unique to veterans that you could talk about. Maybe it's like, VA doctors can't prescribe it, and maybe it's you get medical cannabis in your state. But I think it's the case, right, that the VA is not going to reimburse you. So maybe you could talk a little bit about specific barriers that veterans might face when they're trying to access cannabis treatments.
Right. Yeah. And that's an important thing to remember, is that the VA is a federal system. So it doesn't matter what state that the VA facility's in, they have to abide by federal law. And with cannabis still being a Schedule I drug, VA doctors aren't permitted to prescribe it to their patients, or recommend, right? Is kind of the term that people use. But I mean, here's the thing, like one of the most tragic situations I ran in is when I got a call. I was sitting in my office in K Street in Washington, D.C., and this veteran from Mississippi called me, saw the article that Lou Celli and I wrote in Defense One, and was like, how can I do this? He said, I'm in this situation in Mississippi where if I, continue with opioids, I'm really afraid that bad things are going to happen to my health and my life, and I'm becoming addicted to it, right? And if I use cannabis, I'm a criminal in the state of Mississippi with really harsh penalties. So my options are really a catch-22. Like if I continue on this road, I'm a zombie. If I do what's I think is best for my health, then I'm a criminal, right? What do I choose? And I was like, brother, hearing this breaks my heart, and I can't advise you on that. But but that's real life, right? That's a situation that thousands of injured veterans are facing on a daily basis. So again, like I said, whether it has efficacy or not, I don't have an opinion about, because I'm not a scientist and I'm not doing the triple blind clinical studies. But I will tell you this, that the roadblocks that the federal government has put in place to research cannabis are onerous, right? And if you talk to Dr. Sue Sicily, and I encourage you to get her on your show, she'll tell you about like how the University of Mississippi's got kind of the monopoly on production of cannabis. It doesn't come like any cannabis you've ever seen in your life. Like, typically you walk into a dispensary, as I've done in legal states to check out different medical operations, and you see cultivated flower that's clipped, that's got, tagged with the exact THC and CBD percentages down to the decimal point, right? The stuff you get from NIDA is the entire plant ground up, comes in a bag, looks like green tea powder. And when she got it, she didn't know what was in there, right? She's like, I can't even really tell if this is truly cannabis or what it is. She had to call around to find a Schedule I lab, right? A facility able to test this product, the substance, to see exactly what was in it. And they found that it had significant amounts of lead, right, and other contaminants in there. And so she was like, ethically, is it even safe for me to administer this to my patients to do the research, right? Because she's bound by IRB considerations and has to act within, within the bounds of medical ethics. And so she did find a lab finally, and they tested it, and it's just like such a low grade, low quality product, like, but what she really needs is to be able to go to a pharmaceutical grower that could dial in exactly, what THC and CBD percentage. And quite frankly, what she's finding is that, in the medical community is finding that the potential is not on the THC side of the drug, it's on the cannabinoids or the CBD side. And I think that has to do with the fact that every human being's got an endogenous endocannabinoid system, right? And they really don't teach that in medical school yet, but you have two receptors in your body called CB1 and CB2, and it's like a perfect mate fit for cannabinoids, right, as a receptor. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with like the coevolution of humans and the drug. And your body actually naturally produces cannabinoids, right, as anti-inflammatories and other things. So again, it all comes back to allowing researchers to do the science and being agnostic about the outcomes.
Yeah, and that research, it's a total catch-22, like you were saying. And one phrase you've used before, which I love, is the federal government position does not pass any adult test of epistemology. It's this thing where we know that we have to research the drug to reschedule it, and we can't research until it's rescheduled. So we're kind of an impasse. And we talked about how veterans might face some unique barriers to access, but I think also there could be unique opportunities for veterans. Do you think it's the case that advocacy by veterans is perhaps effective because they're reliant on a government agency, because people care about veterans? Do you think there's a special opportunity for veterans to make an impact and move this forward?
I think there's a soft spot in the American heart for the men and women that have borne the heaviest burden of 2 decades at war, right? And I think it's one thing when traditional cannabis advocates go up to Capitol Hill. I think it's another thing when you have veterans in suits and ties like going up to the Hill and talking to members, right, about their experiences and about their lives and what hurts and what's working for them and what's not working for them. But we do know, like per NIDA, right, like 130 people a day die from Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 and Schedule 3 opioids. And that's the most ridiculous thing, because if you Schedule 1, a drug's got to be considered the most dangerous and most addictive, right? And when you look at the DEA's own website, right, they state no deaths from cannabis overdose have ever been reported. DEA, World Health Organization, like 0. And yet 130 people a day are dying from lower scheduled opioids. And so, I mean, tell me how that stacks up, right? That's like a company of Marines dying every single day from opioid deaths. So I think again, we owe it to people. And I think, when people talk about this being a controversial issue, I got to disagree, right? Like, you look at nationwide polls, greater than 50% of people are for medical cannabis research, like way over 50%. Anything in today's political climate that's over 50% is a landslide winner, right? 92% of veterans opting for the same, right? For research, 82% saying it should be a medically legal treatment option in their state. I mean, what's controversial about it, right? I mean, that's as non-controversial as like puppies are cute. Like we can all agree on that, right? The sky is blue, the earth is round.
There's a few cat people out there, but I mean, puppies are still cute.
I got cats too. I think cats are, I love cats, but yes, I think it's just ridiculous. It just doesn't pass a logic test. So yeah.
It doesn't pass a logic test. And we've talked about how there are so many benefits. There's a lot of research to support benefits, but I also think it's important for us to remember, particularly as the Cannabis Law Society, as an organization that focuses on cannabis and really supports cannabis legalization and that believes in it. I think it's also important to remember that it might not be the end all be all. It might not be a cure all. And I wonder if maybe you could comment a little bit on how, it's not going to be the silver bullet. It's not going to fix everyone's problems.
Oh, no.
What are some limitations? What are some drawbacks? And how do you consider those in balancing treatment with cannabis plus other things maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point, because one of the things that really disturbs me, and when I was talking to some folks who do run dispensaries, I was like, listen, if you ever want this to be considered, a medicinal product, you got to rebrand it. You got to have, people in white lab coats like you would have in a pharmacy. You got to have it come in those little orange bottles with a sterile label with like just some really boring ass descriptor like sativa strain 3.2, right? Rather than like snoochie boochies and gorilla glue and all this other stuff. It's like that doesn't help the argument, right? And I get it, like the libertarian side of the argument I think is the weakest part, right? It's just like I mean, I understand the position, but to me it's just kind of like, go for the science, go for what you can test and apply quantitative data to, right? because that's what gets you in the door to change policy in legislatures, either at the state or federal level. You have to have the science, and then you win the argument with the pathos, right? With the emotional argument of the individuals whose lives are being adversely impacted under current policy and whose lives can be improved with a change of policy, right? But like, I see these folks out there, trying to sell CBD like snake oil, like it's good for everything from like ingrown toenails to, cancer. And it's like, well, probably not, right? Like, I don't know of any substance on the planet that is, Dr. Brown's cure-all, right? That, folks would sell out of the back of traveling wagons in the Wild West. It's, I'm open-minded, but I think at some point, if you're too open-minded, your brain will fall out of your head. So, it's just like, again, but we know how to do this. I mean, we've studied a jillion other substances that we've turned into pharmaceutical products on this planet over the grand arc of medicinal or medical research. So let's allow the scientists to do the research.
It's a magical plant, but it's maybe not the end all. But another magical plant that's relevant in the news right now is our psychedelics.
Yeah.
It's the case that Oregon has gone forward with establishing a medical program where people can enter into treatment with psychedelics, and kind of just broadening this conversation a little bit outside of cannabis. I wonder kind of what your reactions are to pursuing other kinds of treatments. Again, I mean, psychedelics are the type of thing that's not a manufactured pharmaceutical product. It occurs in nature. Maybe it kind of fits within the same cannabis framework.
I've seen some studies, and I'm not as familiar with the psychedelics. You really need to talk to MAPS, or the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and Dr. Sue Sisley is over there, and another guy, I think, oh God, what's his name? It might be Rick Doblin. But they're the ones who are doing, Doblin. They're the ones who are doing studies into psilocybin and how that affects, different ailments. I think they're taking a look at LSD and how microdosing of that will also help with certain things. And I think they're making some traction on that, but again, I'm agnostic on the outcomes. I think we should allow, triple blind studies to take place and follow the facts. So, but I think it's exciting. I think, anything that shows the potential to have scientific efficacy that reduces human suffering on the planet, we should follow, right? And so I mean, that's the other thing too. Is, going back to the earlier point, like despite cannabis being on Schedule 1, in 2018 the FDA approved Epidiolex, right, to treat epilepsy. I mean, again, I'm just flabbergasted at the inconsistencies in logic. So.
It's all about research. That's what we got to do. Go on.
Your point earlier about, like, and I'm kind of skipping around a little bit here, but about folks decriminalizing different drugs. I think the human impact on having treated drug use, right? I'm not talking about trafficking or production. I'm talking about individual use of addictive substances as like some sort of moral thing that people have been treated as criminals for instead of as patients for. I think is a really interesting thing, right? Taking a look at all the nonviolent offenders who are in jail right now for drug use, and some who have been 3 strikes you're out, right? That's the cost to the American taxpayer to keep nonviolent offenders incarcerated for that. I think is something that really, really needs a hard look, right? Because I think lives have been shattered over. So hey, let's treat folks with addiction not as moral failures, but as people who need medical help. That stands because what I've read about addiction and the brain and how some people are just wired differently. Some people are, brain chemistry has a little bit more addictive personalities and less ability to restrain in the prefrontal cortex, and that's just biology, right? That's not a product of will. That's a product of biology and evolution. So, I think we need to reevaluate that as well.
I think you're so right. And since we don't have any sponsors for this podcast yet, I'm going to make a quick little plug for the Cannabis Law Society's initiative right now. We're trying to start doing service, start trying to doing expungements for people in Missouri and maybe on a broader scale. So just all our listeners out there, make sure you stay tuned for Cannabis Law Society's service initiatives coming up in spring 2021. So Joe, kind of to maybe transition back a little bit and out of the cannabis into your personal life. You talked about growing up Catholic family with the nuns and everything like that. What do you think people who knew you well growing up would say about your advocacy? What would they say about this intro I just gave you? You know, what would they say? Would they say we expected Joe to go do all these things, or?
Yeah, I mean, I was pissing off the nuns in 5th grade because I was watching Carl Sagan's Cosmos series, right? And so, like, you know, once that took root, you know, he was kind of like the Neil deGrasse Tyson of the 80s and 90s. And, you know, I was just remember asking questions in religion class in 5th grade. It's kind of like, oh, wait, so this guy survived how many days in the belly of a whale without a scuba tank? Like, you know, come on, sister. Like, you're joking with us, right? And so yeah, I got a lot of.
Well, it's a metaphor, Joe. I think you have to learn how to read beyond a literal level.
Yeah, that was 5th grade. Come on,
yeah,
give me a break. But I mean, you know, that's kind of where my love of science started. Was really with that PBS series, and just realizing that because if we use our brains and we use the tools that you know humans have developed over the last 200,000 years, right? You know, going from manipulation of fire and the stone axe to being able to build the International Space Station, like, you know, we can detect things about this, you know, our environment, and, you know, at the macro level with cosmology, and at the micro level, right? You know, all the way now down to like subatomic particles, where, you know, logic and math that gets you to those spots kind of fails. When you go below that, right, which is really interesting stuff. But yeah, I think it's for them, people knowing me since 5th grade, be like, hey, this is entirely on brand. And once that combined with, like, you know, punk rock music when I was in high school, man, it was off to the races. So, you know, it's I've always had a low tolerance for bullshit and hypocrisy, and a mind to do something about it. So.
And mind to do something. And it seems like the Marine Corps was maybe an interesting path. I mean, as kind of a rebel, how did you kind of take that turn? It's a very, you know, rigid and law and order kind of career, right?
It is, but like with that said, you know, I remember, you know, when I was first approached by a Marine Corps recruiter to consider their officer program, I literally spit my beer out across the lawn, right? It was at this party in college, and I was like, hey, brother, I'm not the guy for you. And he's like, well, what are you doing with the rest of your life? It was a graduation party, right? And I was like, well, hey, I'm moving out to Boulder, Colorado. I'm going to go be a rock climbing guy with my buddy TR, right? That was the plan. And not probably the most thought out plan, you know, when I was 23 years old, but, you know, what the hey. And so, but I also, you know, had a respect for military service. Like, all the dads in my Boy Scout troop were, you know, pretty much enlisted guys in the Vietnam War, right? Vietnam vets. And then my grandfather had a short career in World War II. All my great uncles had served in World War II. And my uncle on my dad's side and my uncle on my mom's side both served, you know, one in the Air Force, one in the Marine Corps. And so I didn't have a mind for military service, but I certainly respected military service. And then I also was super suspicious of power and the government, right? And so at some point it kind of dawned on me. It was like, well, if I truly feel this way, that Madison was right, that there's no greater threat to liberty than a standing army, then what am I going to do about it, right? And so it's kind of counterintuitive, but largely because of those motivations, I kind of found my way into joining the Marine Corps, right? That plus a challenge, plus the ability to kind of, you know, have a high sensation seeking, adventure focused lifestyle is what really drew me in initially.
It's a sober rock climbing, maybe.
Yeah.
You could say that. I mean, and that's kind of an interesting point. So I would imagine that screening new recruits for whatever branch of the military, there's a lot of drug testing that goes on, right?
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
Comment on how, I mean, maybe someone that's thinking about joining the military, what do they have to look out for in terms of maybe they've used cannabis in the past, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, they'll be asked about that by the recruiter, and typically, if it's like cannabis or pretty much they can write waivers if the kid's a competitive competitive person, by all the other requirements that it takes to join the military, 9 times out of 10 they'll be able to get a waiver for that. Right now, if there's like trafficking or dealing or things like that, that's a little bit harder to get past. But if they just disclose, yeah, I used cannabis when I was in high school or whatever, I don't now, and knowing that they're going to have to take a drug test before they ship to boot camp, then that's workable. It's not impossible. It's easier if you haven't in the past, but they write waivers every day for stuff like that.
And it's good they write waivers, right? But again, that could be, you could
Yeah,
read that
I mean,
as a little bit more of hypocrisy, right? Where like there's this, Schedule 1 terrible drug, but we'll give you a waiver if we really want you to be here. So
yeah, I mean, I'll put it like this: like I know people who've drunk themselves to death, right? And alcohol is completely legal in every state in the country, and I don't know anybody that's smoked cannabis themselves to death. Just a fact in the material universe, right?
Yeah, it is. Hey, Joe, so thank you so much for coming on. We'll wrap it up here. And we've given people a lot of info. I'm going to make sure we include a link to your personal website in the show notes. Thanks. And I'll make sure that we get maybe some links to articles that you've written for people to read, and so they can know more about you and the work that you're doing. But really appreciate you coming on for this episode. Yeah. It's been awesome talking with you, learning from you, and I really appreciate it.
No, that's awesome, man. And I'll make sure I introduce you to just a few other folks. I think Dr. C. Sisley would be an awesome interview for you if you want to continue down that road with the psychedelic research.